Shalom and good morning. I'm staying home for another week. Just make sure that my cold is nothing serious. Thank Yahweh, there's no temperature at any time. And thank you for your prayers. Now today, if there's time, I would like to continue my sharing last week. And I've titled this week's sharing, Covid-19 and Christians. Allow me to read the text from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 17 to 19. For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of Elohim, and if it first begins at us, what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel of Elohim? And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear? Wherefore, let them that suffer according to the will of Elohim commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator. Now in last week's sharing, I mentioned that during this time of this COVID-19 crisis, Christians are being led to the comforting verses of Psalms 91 by the pastors and perhaps by their own reading. Because particularly Psalms 91 verse 9 to 11, because thou hast made Yahweh, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation, there shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come near thy dwelling. For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. I mentioned last week that Joseph Prince of New Creation Church quoted these verses in a sermon recently to assure his members that no virus can come near them. But paradoxically, as I said, he began his sermon by telling those who have flu-like symptoms to stay away from service. So apparently the verses are not applicable to the poor victims. The truth is that we're only protected if we dwell in the secret place of the Almighty and abide under his shadow. You've got to go to Psalms 91 verse 1 right at the beginning. And then verses 2 and 4 says we are to trust in him, put our trust in him. Now, how many Christians really trust in him? And verse 4 in particular says, in order that we abide in him, we must walk in his truth. And his truth includes his Torah and every word that's written in the Bible for us. We cannot pick and choose what we want and discard what we find inconvenient. And I also made reference to Psalms 15 and verse 1. Who shall abide in thy tabernacle, O Yahweh? Who shall dwell in thy holy hill? And in verse 2, the answer, he that walketh uprightly and worketh righteousness and speaketh the truth in his heart. And then Psalms 24 verses 3 and 4, who shall ascend into the hill of Yahweh? Who shall stand in his holy place? Verse 4, he that hath clean hands and a pure heart, who hath not lifted up his soul unto vanity, and nor sworn deceitfully. And in other words, we need clean hands and a pure heart. Now, how many Christians can truly claim all of these, including myself? So let's not be presumptuous, as the psalmist says in Psalms 19, verses 12 and to 14. Who can understand his errors? Cleanse me from secret faults. Keep back thy servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then shall I be upright and I shall be innocent from the great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Yahweh, my strength and my Redeemer. Please note, in both the SARS crisis and this current crisis of COVID-19, pastors were the first casualties. In the SARS crisis, a pastor from Kim Kiat Road died after going to hospital to lay his hands on a sick brother. In this current crisis, the senior pastor and at least 22 members of Grace Assembly of God formed the largest cluster of infections. There's also another church involved, as you would have read for the papers. So what does it mean? Why should Christians, including pastors, be casualties of such crisis? Well, we've got to go back to the meaning of church. What is a church? The very first occurrence of this word in the King James is Matthew 16:18, where Yeshua says, "And I also say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." And the Greek word that is translated as church is the word ecclesia. And ecclesia means a calling out, a meeting, a religious congregation, an assembly, and what we call a church. And notice the word church occurs 115 times in the New Testament. But the Greek word ecclesia has two components. Ek, which means from or out of, and kaleo, which means call forth. So therefore, a church is a group or assembly of people who have been called out of the world to Elohim. The verses from 1 Peter that I quoted earlier, which said that judgment begins with the house of Elohim. Why do you think Peter said that? I believe the reason is that so many Christians are still so worldly and do not take their calling seriously. The building is not a church. You will note that the building of Grace Assembly of God at Tangling is being sanitized because of the virus. But what about the members? Are they being sanitized from the contamination of the world? Are we being sanitized from the contamination of the world? In Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of Elohim, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto Elohim, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of Elohim. So spiritual sanitizing involves both our bodies and our minds. And please note that the church represents or consists of the people of Elohim. And read carefully the words of 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 12. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that you should show forth the praises of him that called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of Elohim, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, Abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. Having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify Elohim in the day of visitation. These verses contain many important thoughts. I just mentioned them in passing, and in the future sharing, we shall have occasion to examine them in greater detail. Firstly, we are chosen generation. Chosen. Second, we are to be a royal priesthood. Third, we are to be a holy nation. Now remember, I mentioned so many times that every time you see the word holy, think of sanctification. Think of being set apart unto Yahweh. And we are to be a peculiar people. Peculiar. Is it any wonder that when people in the world look at those of us who are fervently serving Yahweh as strange people? People literally out of this world and perhaps out of their minds. And we are to abstain from lust, which Peter says, such lust war against the soul. That means they are impediments in the salvation of our souls. And more than that, the last thought in this passage is that when we entertain the lust of the world, when we indulge in them, we become enemies of Elohim. Enemies. In fact, James chapter 4 verse 4, in Cantonese you say, say, ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with Elohim? Whoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of Elohim. I think it's dangerous for anyone to be enemy of Elohim. Satan is the chief enemy. So when we are friends with the world, we ally ourselves with Satan and his demonic angels, fallen angels, and we too become enemies of Yahweh. And the last point that I want to share with you today, there are a lot more that we can continue sharing about the Ecclesia, the Church of Yahweh. And I want to quote in closing 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 17 and 18. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith Yahweh, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you. And I will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, says Yahweh Almighty. You might like to note that, as I said last week, the Chinese in Wuhan and elsewhere in China eat all kinds of unclean things. Their wet markets are full of animals like birds, dogs and cats and snakes, rats, and anteaters, the pangolin. Scientists have noted that the makeup, the genome of pangolin is about 99% identifiable with the Covid-19 virus. So it appears to be the source of it. And remember, when SARS occurred, the civet cat was identified to be the source of the infection. So have a good week ahead of you, and shalom once again, and may Yahweh bless this sharing of His word. Amen.